And let me introduce our first poet, Dorothy Yamamoto. And I'll just find my notes here. So Dorothy Yamamoto grew up in Barnet, North London, where her Japanese father and English mother settled after the war. That divided background is the source of many of her poems. She now lives in Oxford, where she helps to run 2 local poetry groups and organizes readings and poetry workshops. She has worked as a teacher and university lecturer and is now a freelance writer and editor. As well as poetry, she writes non-fiction books about animals, for example, Guinea Pig and Wild Boar, both published by Reaction Books. Dorothy's first collection, Landscape with 100 Bridges by Blinking Eye Publishing, was published in 2007 when she won a competition judged by poet Don Patterson. Since then, she's edited Hands and Wings, an anthology in the aid of charity Freedom from Torture, and her pamphlet Honshu Bees by Templar Poetry came out in spring 2018. And I always add a little personal reflection on the work of a poet. So I've read your work, Dorothy, and I found poems where I thought things are the same but different. So a great-grandfather dies and returns to the fetus position. In another poem, snow turns into a cat and then into a reflection of how snow is both the same and different all over the world, and then into a memory of a father, both distant and near. And in yet another poem, a father reads fairy tales from end to beginning, and we see how stories could turn out if only read differently. And this is a poetry of very refined imagery, the noticing of details, stained tobacco fingers, a book fluttering its pages like wings, a stoat curling its body into S's. These are chiseled poems that are not afraid to change under your eyes into something that shimmers in the corner of the room, but can never be quite seen, let alone defined. So, Dorothy, I have a question that I always like to ask the featured poets before they start the reading. And the question I have this time is, what is a quality that you really admire in either a poem or a poet?
I've thought about that, and it's very hard. I just know when I've read a poem if it's worked for me or not. I suppose I like the feeling of a person developing their thoughts as they're actually writing, as if they've gone into the poem without thinking, now I'm going to write a poem about this or that, but the poem actually develops as they write. I love images. I love things that make me see the world in a slightly different way. I love poems about animals.
And they are very, I mean, I would love them too as well. So yes. So that's a really interesting answer. And we would love to hear more from you, of course. So please take us into your poetry.
Okay, well, first, thank you for inviting me. I'm going to read some poems about my father and then a couple more just to show I don't always write about him. But he has been a great inspiration to me, exploring that sense of difference. I think in a way, we're different from everybody else in the world. And perhaps having a father who came to England from a different place has sharpened that sense for me. Anyway, I'm going to read a poem about a horse. This was a horse. My father told me about this horse, which was used in the war against Russia at the beginning of the last century. And in the village, there was a man who used to be a cavalry officer, and he fought in the war against Russia. This seems almost unimaginably ancient to me, but my father was quite old when I was born, so his memories do go right back. And after the war, this man, who was called Aijiro, was allowed to take a horse back to the village with him. Not the horse that he'd been riding, which I suppose was too valuable, but one of the horses that had been used to pull the gun carriages. And this is my father remembers Ijiro's horse. There were many horses in the village, but only one beautiful one. It belonged to Ijiro, the cavalry officer, who groomed it lovingly, never worked it hard, fretted when it stepped on ice. Every summer, there were races at Takamiya along a dried-up riverbed. All the farm horses in the neighbourhood, fat, thin, tall, short, clocked along to take part. The farmers' boys strapped cushions on their backs, but the horses, who were used to pulling carts, bucked and whinnied madly. At the finishing line, an official dangled pieces of paper, first, second, third, to be grabbed by the jockeys as they stampeded past. First prize was, say, a bamboo rake or a wooden tub or bucket with money in it, 5 yen perhaps. Ijiro never entered his horse for the race, although, my father said, half understanding, half not, it would have won easily. And this is Japanese fairy story, which you mentioned. I guess that most of you know the story of Little Red Riding Hood. Well, I don't know, do you? She meets a wolf when she's going to visit her grandmother. And I expect you also know that Japanese books are read from the back to the front, not from the front to the back. This always used to puzzle us when we saw our father reading. We couldn't understand why he started at the end. Anyway, a Japanese fairy story. We watched our father read books from the end to the beginning, a habit full of possibilities. The woodcutter, for example, rushed urgently back to the forest to stack his axe safely against the woodpile. The grandmother, waking from a dream of indigestion, got up and squinted at the visitor, dodging away from her through the trees. The little girl's mother undid the strings of her hood and unpacked her basket, replacing the cakes and honey on the shelf, like a good housekeeper. And the wolf. Once he was out of sight, the wolf dropped to all fours, leaving the pages riffling over his head, and went loping out of that world. Hungry, true, but unbothered by speech. And one more about my father. This is the mushroom shed. One of his memories was going up onto the mountains near his village to pick mushrooms. And because Japanese society is very organized, all the villagers had a patch on the mountain where they picked, and they were not supposed to go and pick in anybody else's patch, even though it was all wild countryside. And they paid a man to sit and watch that you only picked in your own patch. The mushroom shed. If they come back, my mother will materialize in her armchair, a book fluttering its new white wings. But my father will walk through the garden, looking critically at everything, the unswept leaves, the ground elder sneaking onto the lawn. I think the shy sculpts of the carrots will please him, also the bird table with its offering of crumbled rice. But the moment I wait for, is when he eases open the door and steps into darkness. He's back on the mountainside among the mushroom plots, roped off for neighbours. The old watchman, Coma, lets him through. The smell of the mushrooms is everywhere. He kneels among the braille of pine needles, hoping to uncover their whole bald world. As here, by the empty trays, I watch his fingers silently questioning, and little again, I crouch close to him, almost behind him, to see what he sees. Okay, just read one more poem about my father and then a poem that's not about him. This is Cranes in the Snow Country. It came from, it's got three sources. One was finding out the snow country is the far north of Japan, where they have an amazing amount of snow. And they also make paper from mulberry fibres, and the paper is laid out on the snow to bleach. Also, there are lots of Japanese cranes up there, and I saw a program about a man who went out every day to feed them. And the last thing was my father's memory of he wasn't born in the snow country. He was born on Honshu, main island, but it did snow a lot there too. And I remember him telling me that one day when he woke up, he pulled back the door of he was living with his grandparents, he pulled back the door of their house, a sliding paper door, and there was just a wall of white outside. The snow had covered the house. And that seemed such an amazing image to me. Anyway, Cranes in the Snow Country. It has to be white, the paper. For how else would you see the loneliness of house and fence and tree, or the red caps of the cranes who dance their stately dance deep in the snow country? There they spread mulberry fibres on bleaching fields for the ultraviolet and ozone of snowmelt, harvesting the weather's gift, so that what blanks out thought, the sliding doors my father opened upon a pure wall of white, can be overwritten with what we can speak of. The man with the plastic bucket who tramps out every day to throw handfuls of grain, or my father tunnelling towards the light. I'm going to read just one more poem, and this, although it does have a Japanese connection, is not about my father. It's about, it was inspired by a print in the Ashmolean Museum here in Oxford, and it's called A New Year Dog. Oh, before I start, a koto is a Japanese stringed instrument. It's you put it on the table and you play it by plucking the strings. A New Year Dog. When the poets gather for their New Year recital, there's always a small dog among them. A dog that no one actually remembers bringing, but who is there nevertheless, listening attentively to the verses, ear bent like an envelope, head cocked to one side. And when the oldest poet plucks the silk strings of the koto, the dog inches his plumy tail, note by note, across the floor, like a bird hopping along a branch. He's a little offbeat, but watching him, the poets find themselves filled with joy and take up their pens, new for the new year. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful.